Okay, so today we're talking about Romanticism, and as you can see, it's concurrent with the neoclassical period, right? It's also 1780 to 1860, which are pretty sort of general dates, right? And it's happening alongside of neoclassicism, and to a large degree, it's reacting against the ideas of the Enlightenment and neoclassicism, which it felt was like much too restrictive. It starts as a literary movement, spreads to the visual arts, music, and culture in general. So it's against neoclassicism. It moves away from a subject matter dealing with classical antiquity in favor of a subject matter that to them seemed more exotic, right? More exotic times and places like the medieval period, the Orient, Africa, and the Near East. And a lot of that stems from France's colonization of a lot of these areas. It also moves away from the neoclassical emphasis on rationality and order to more of an interest in the irrational aspects of human existence and cognition, like fantasy or nightmare or emotion. It's influenced by two kind of major philosophers. The first one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed in freedom, right? The freedom of thought, feeling, action, worship, speech, taste. And believers in Romanticism felt that the path to freedom was through imagination rather than reason, through feeling and emotion rather than thinking. And so they kind of take the opposite view. Another major thinker is Edmund Burke, who's a British philosopher, and his concept of the sublime, which is a hard thing to articulate. Basically, he talks about it as feelings of awe, right? Sort of the inspiring feelings that are sort of mixed with fear or terror. And his reasoning was that pain and fear are the most intense human emotions that can be evoked. And that while you don't like to experience pain or fear personally, that from a distance or sort of vicariously, these emotions can be very thrilling. And he typically uses the examples of nature in order to explain it, right? So we like to look at raging rivers or huge thunderstorms if we're, safe from them, but we don't want to actually be in them. You don't want to be in the river or in the middle of the thunderstorm, but to watch it makes that you experience a sense of sort of the awe of the power of nature, and the kind of vicarious feeling of fear, but a thrilling kind of fear. The artist most closely associated with the Romantic movement in France is Eugene Delacroix, and this is his painting, The Death of Sardanapalus. And the history of early 19th century painting tends to be articulated as this contest between Ingres, who's the draftsman, and Delacroix, who's the colorist. And so it's a new kind of disegno colorido debate, again, a kind of Renaissance Baroque debate, one that sees art as either intellectual or emotional, right? Art that comes from and appeals to the head versus art that comes from and appeals to the heart or the soul. And so we have that dichotomy again crop up. Delacroix took a trip to Africa, Morocco, and southern Spain and was fascinated by the non-Western cultures depicted there. And he takes his subject actually from a play by Byron, and it's a play about this Assyrian ruler who orders this mass suicide or execution of his coterie instead of being captured, right, when his palace is under siege. So it's a subject taken from the Near East, seen as exotic and sort of erotic because they're, showing these members of this harem culture. Delacroix talks about this specifically in the booklet that was created for the salon that this was exhibited at, and he writes a little blurb for it, and he says, "The refugees are besieged in his palace. Lying on a superb bed atop an immense pyre, Sardanapalus orders his eunuchs and palace officers to slit the throats of his women, his pages, and even his horses and favorite dogs. None of the objects that served his pleasure should survive him." End quote. And so you can kind of get a sense of out of spite rather than, allowing these people to be captured, everyone dies. So the painting has this exciting subject matter, right? Very sort of thrilling and, dramatic scene. And it's arranged on this strong, strong diagonal that divides it in two, from the column Sardanapalus in white on the bed, and then down across the diagonal of the bed to the kind of chaos below. We see that the fire is already spreading. There's some smoke in the background, and it sort of curls at the top of the picture. And the floor also seems to be almost disappearing, right? The sense of disequilibrium is provoked by the perspective, also the skewed perspective of the bed. And so it gives us a sense of instability. It's hard to see, for example, where the horse in the lower left corner is even coming from. Like, where is this horse in the space of the room? It doesn't make sense. But that sense of instability adds to the kind of chaos of the scene. Also, his distinctive treatment of color kind of adds to the chaos as well. We see this repeated reds, golds, blacks, whites that sort of cause our eye to move around the canvas, following the different reds and other colors in this kind of swirling composition. Again, it's meant to be kind of exotic and erotic. We see all of the different poses, the women who are, being stabbed, the horses being stabbed. All of that is meant to heighten the sense of drama and sort of the emotional impact of the scene. We can compare this to Ingres, right, as kind of a classic neoclassical example versus a typical romantic example. So Ingres on the left here, very intellectual, very calm, versus Delacroix on the right, very emotional and dramatic. Essentially the difference between order and chaos, right? On the left we see a classical subject, this intellectual genealogy in front of this Greek temple, versus on the right this exotic subject, this harem, and this scene of violence. On the left, an organized composition that's very symmetrical, versus on the right, a very swirling and chaotic composition based on a very strong diagonal. On the left, color is contained within line, and on the right, the repetition of the colors, as we said, adds to this sense of chaos. And it doesn't really leave us, our eye, a place to land. We're constantly sort of swirling around the image, whereas in the Ingres on the left, your eye really tends to rest on the image of Homer. The even light of the neoclassical is contrasted to the dramatic lights and darks of the romantic, right? And again, this dichotomy is similar to the dichotomy between Italian Renaissance and Italian Baroque. Delacroix also refers to current events, but of course uses his Romanticism to give them a dramatic flair. Here he presents liberty leading the people, and it's a scene from the Revolution of 1830, another Parisian uprising, another revolution against the rule of Charles X, the end of July of 1830. So basically, after Napoleon leaves, more stuff happens, and they get a monarchy again in France. And so, the people are like, well, we fought to get rid of the first monarchy, we're going to fight to get rid of this one too. And so this is another revolution. We see in the midst of it, however, an allegorical personification of liberty as this, in the guise of this young working class woman, and she's defiantly going forward with the Republic's tricolor banner of fraternité, equalité, liberté, right? And she's urging the masses to fight on. We know that she's an allegory, really, because she's partially nude, but also because she wears this, what we call a Phrygian cap. And this cap was a symbol from antiquity of a freed slave. And so it's a symbol of freedom, but in this case, referring to the freedom from tyranny and from monarchy. Around her are Parisian types, right? A street boy with pistols on the right, on the far left, a worker with a cutlass, in the middle, a kind of dandy, a sort of upper class student in a top hat with a shot-off musket. And this kind of suggests the different classes of people who all sort of banded together for this cause. We see them climbing over what appears to be a barricade. That was a common way of that the French people in the revolution sort of fought against the army, was to create these barricades in the streets. And we see a couple of dead men in the lower right-hand corner in uniform, who are the royal troops who fought against the insurrection, and they're contrasted to the people who are in their regular clothing, who again are not specific portraits, they're types, right? And so it refers to this broader event. This is the same revolution that was featured in Victor Hugo and eventually Broadway's Les Miserables. And there's something about this painting where you can almost hear it, right? We see Notre Dame in the distance, and we can almost hear the song, from the musical, you can, in this way. Here we have another Romantic artist. This is Géricault. And his painting, The Raft of the Medusa, another huge painting, this one 16 by 23 feet. And he's also showing an actual historical event with all the theatricality of Romanticism. The story of this is a shipwreck that actually took place in 1816, so just a few years before, off the coast of Africa. And it's this French ship, the Medusa, which had run aground on a reef due to the incompetence of its captain. And so rather than being just a tragedy, the captain was actually a political appointee who presumably did not have the training necessary to really be it, but the captain, but who was appointed this position without earning it. And so it becomes not just a tragedy, but a huge political scandal. In a last-ditch effort to survive, 150 of those who survived the initial crash built a raft from the remains of the ship. And again, they're sort of, they run onto a reef, but they're not close to shore, so they can't just swim. Now, the raft drifts for 12 days, and the number of survivors falls to 15, right? So 10% of the original people are the only ones who survive. And again, they're without water, without food for 12 days, just sort of floating on this raft. What Géricault shows is the moment when the survivors see another ship on the horizon, the ship that we know in the historical narrative that actually does come to save them, right? And that's how people know about what happens, because some people did in fact survive. So this is the moment when the survivors, they see the ship as this blip, this tiny, tiny dot on the horizon under the guy's elbow who's holding the sort of white shirt. You can see the tiny little speck on the horizon. The painter here, Géricault, aims to show all of the horror and the emotion of the event with the grandeur and impact of this large-scale history painting. So he creates this sort of jumble of bodies in an X-shaped composition. And the main diagonal runs from the lower left up to the upper right. And we see sort of the dead and dying, and figures who, even though they, some of the other ones are excited, these figures still, have no hope. They've lost all hope, and there's just this sense of despair. We have other figures in the middle who, seem to want to participate, but are probably too weak. And then finally, at this apex of this kind of pyramid of hope, we see a couple of figures who muster their last strength to take the shirts off their back and wave frantically, hoping that this tiny, tiny ship in the distance sees them. And even though we know, because this is a historical event, that they do eventually get rescued, at this moment it seems like almost impossible, right, that the ship will see them. The other diagonal that's sort of crossing that is from the sort of makeshift mast that they have down to the body in the lower right that appears to be kind of falling into the viewer space, right? And so again, it's meant to show this kind of excitement. We see storm clouds brewing, right? We see that the waves are choppy. It's not sort of a simple scene. And the color is very sort of dark and gloomy, right? There's not a lot of hope present, but there's just enough to give us a sense of excitement, right? Will they be rescued? Jericho aimed for a high degree of accuracy, right? He visited hospitals and morgues to examine corpses. He interviewed the survivors and had a raft constructed in his studio to have models on. And so we see here a couple of his studies of severed arms and heads, for the bodies of the dead. In England, we have Turner painting another kind of sea-related contemporary historical event with all the passion and energy of kind of the romantic sensibility and using the similar sense of the sublime in that we see the awe of the power of nature kind of mixed with a sense of terror here. So this is an English artist, Turner, and he's showing an incident that happens actually in 1783, so a fairly significant amount of time before he paints it, but it's an incident that's reported in a book called The History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and that book had just been reprinted in 1839, just a year before this painting, so it probably is what prompts the depiction of this event. The story that's being told is that there's a captain of a slave ship that realizes that his insurance company would only reimburse him for slaves who were lost at sea, not for those who died en route. So he orders the sick and dying to be thrown overboard, right? And the depiction here echoes its barbaric nature. We see the sun that looks like a comet. We see the entire horizon in the sort of blood red tones. And as the ship is moving off into the distance, you can see in its wake in the foreground a number of body parts, right? We see some hands and some feet coming out of the water. The sort of black lines that you see are the manacles and chains that will surely make them drown, right? So we see the relative scale of the human forms, which are tiny, versus the sea and the sky, which is huge. And this reinforces the sense of the sublime, right? The power of nature over humans. Part of the subtitle is Typhoon Coming On, right? Which suggests, again, more imminent danger and gives a reason for the swirling mass of sky and water. In what is Turner's really sort of idiosyncratic style, which is often referred to as visionary, because he's exploring the emotional power of pure color as being more important than the forms themselves, right? That he kind of releases color from sort of defining outlines, and because it expresses in this more abstract way the forces of nature and our response to it, it's a step towards 20th century abstract art. We can see the degree to which he abandons form in a comparison with Jericho. Turner instead puts all of the horror in his use of the color, whereas Jericho it's more about the description of forms and a more clear sort of narrative telling of the story. And so we see, the very sort of tightly painted work of Jericho versus the very loosely painted work of Turner, emphasizing color as a way of expressing emotion rather than narrative or the story itself. Moving out over to Spain, Spanish Romantic is Goya, and he's known for painting kind of more typical romantic themes like nightmares and fantasies, but he also applies his romantic style to contemporary events. Goya lives during a particularly tumultuous time in Spanish history. There's basically a dispute over the throne, and the son of the king and queen had asked Napoleon, the French emperor for military help to sort of oust the king and queen. So Napoleon agrees. He invades, ousts the king and queen, but then he stabs this guy in the back and installs his brother, his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. So the Spanish had originally seen the French as liberators, right, getting rid of rulers who they disliked. But eventually, of course, they realized that the French are in fact invaders. And on the 2nd of May in 1808, the Spanish attacked the Napoleonic soldiers. The next day, the 3rd of May, which is the title of our painting here, in retaliation, the French start to execute Spanish citizens, just sort of left and right. And this is the event shown in the picture. So this is in 1808, this is painted in 1814, so it's only 6 years later, so it's a relatively contemporary political event that Goya was commissioned, after eventually the Spanish do get the French out. Goya is commissioned to paint the most heroic moments of the Spanish resistance. Of course, Goya is on Spanish and on the side of the Spanish. So he paints this wall of Napoleonic soldiers, in this uniform stance as this kind of firing squad, as sort of brutal executioners, right? And he makes the soldiers more terrifying and, of course, encourages sympathy for the peasants by showing the soldiers with their back to the viewer as this kind of cold and faceless masks without any humanity. And so this is contrasted, of course, by the peasants, whose anguished and terrified faces are shown in full force, right? They have a lot of humanity, whereas the firing squad does not. We see this particularly in the central figure's pose with his arms out that resembles the pose of Christ on the cross, making us sort of understand or underlines that these people are martyrs. And the drama is also enhanced through the lighting. We have the deep blacks of the background highlighted with the stark white that comes from the lantern in front. And he captures this single moment, right? This split second between life and death, this man in front of the firing squad. But we also understand that he is just one of many, right? It's not a portrait. It's not a specific person. He just is representative of all of them, because we see a few who have already been executed dead in the foreground. And then if we trace the line of people who are awaiting execution, the line runs all the way back to the church in the far distance, right? And so it gives this sense of horror, right? That this is just going to be, kind of an assembly line of death. If we compare Goya's painting to David's, we see Goya's the horror of war and slaughter in this contemporary event versus David's, depiction of war or battle as a matter of honor, showing a story from ancient Rome. We see Goya has this strong diagonal composition versus the much more sort of orderly and organized and symmetrical composition of David's. We see that the strong contrast of light and dark in the 3rd of May suggests kind of the idea of darkness taking over all that is good, versus a much more even light in David's. And you can also see in Goya's a much looser painting, right? A sort of rough, patchy, sort of flat painting style that underscores a sense of gritty realism, versus the neoclassical that has, again, the saturated colors, the strong lines, the very sort of careful articulation of every single detail. And I blew up here for you 2 of the faces from each of them, and you can really see I think sharply the difference between the painting styles, right? Goya's far more loosely painted in this more expressive way, versus David's, where every single paint stroke is covered, that we really see, every tiny hair and every wrinkle on this man's face, to show kind of the clarity of his painting style. Moving to Germany, we also see romantic landscapes developing. Landscape painting becomes kind of an art in and of its own right. And we see in this period, particularly in the 19th century, an interest in what we call the picturesque. And that basically means that it's sort of worthy of being painted, but it had a really specific connotation in that a picturesque landscape is one that is characterized by a kind of irregularity, a roughness, a wildness that was more sort of seen as being more visually interesting than kind of a beautiful blossoming tree, right? Like anybody can appreciate a beautiful blossoming tree, but it takes kind of an aesthetic sensibility to find kind of beauty and visual interest in the sort of gnarly old sort of dead tree. The landscapes are sort of fanciful in this way because landscape was seen as being kind of used for allegory, right? To kind of comment on spiritual or moral or philosophical issues. Here we see Caspar David Friedrich, his Abbey in the Oak Forest, and Friedrich is this major landscape painter, and he fills his landscape with a sense of the sort of sacred here. His picture shows this funeral procession carrying a coffin into the ruins of a Gothic church. We know it's Gothic because of the lancet window. And emblems of death are everywhere. There's the desolate season of winter, the skeletal trees, the tombstones around the church, the people dressed in black, and the kind of church itself, which is basically just a ruin, right? It's just, one wall basically that's left. And so the whole painting serves as a meditation on human mortality and a meditation on death rather than kind of a, clear depiction of a landscape. It's imaginary to evoke this sense of emotion. We can see this particularly if we contrast it to Ruysdael's view of Haarlem, right, from the Dutch Baroque, which shows, again, a very kind of optically correct view, right? It's a real place versus this abbey in a forest, which is imaginary. Ruysdael's is very naturalistic, trying to capture sort of everyday life, whereas Friedrich's is very romantic, very emotional, and very sort of artificial in that way. And again, it's to evoke the sense of wonder or of danger or some kind of emotional response that is part of the Romantic movement. Finally, we also have the Romantic landscapes painted in the United States. This is Niagara Falls, painted by Frederick Edwin Church. He's known for having an extreme facility in sort of detailed execution, right? A sharpness of focus that basically, if you took a microscope up to his painting, it would only add more detail, right? It wouldn't take away detail. That's how sort of sharply detailed his work tends to be. He's famous for this image of Niagara Falls, this national landmark that had gained particular prominence in American sense of their own kind of nationalistic pride around the time of the opening of the nearby Erie Canal. And again, he's playing on this tradition of the sublime, right? He gives us this panoramic view that grants us access to this wonder of God's creation as they saw it. But he also provides us no land on which we as a viewer can stand, right? So it feels like we are ourselves in the falls about to go over. And so that sense of thrill and danger and fear combined with the sense of, the awe-inspiring sort of power of nature creates the experience of the sublime. This painting was meant to be read as a statement of nationhood and the power of the American nation, even though it's actually painted from the Canadian side. Okay, so that's the end of Romanticism. Next time we will pick up with realism.